The wreckage smell hit David Cruz before he even stepped through the airlock. Metal twisted into impossible shapes, circuits fried beyond recognition, and something else. Something organic that made his stomach turn. The crashed ship had appeared on their sensors 3 days ago, tumbling dead through space until Titan's Rest's gravity well caught it. David adjusted his helmet light and moved deeper into the alien vessel. 20 years as a mining station engineer had shown him plenty of wrecked ships, but nothing like this. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint energy, and strange symbols glowed weakly along what might have been control panels. Everything felt wrong, like the ship had been built by minds that thought in completely different ways. A soft whimper stopped him cold. The sound came from somewhere ahead, weak and desperate. David's first thought was impossible. No one could survive a crash like this. But the sound came again, definitely alive and definitely in pain. He pushed through a tangle of debris and found himself in what looked like a nursery. The creature huddled in the corner was no bigger than a house cat, covered in scales that shifted from deep blue to silver in his light. Wings hung broken at its sides and burns covered most of its small body, but the eyes that looked up at him held intelligence, ancient, frightened but unmistakably aware. "Well, hello there, little guy," David whispered, slowly removing his gloves. The creature flinched but didn't run. Its breathing was shallow and rapid. Without thinking, David reached out and gently touched the tiny head. The creature's scales felt warm, almost hot, and it made a sound somewhere between a purr and a sigh. David's comm crackled. "Cruz, you find anything worth salvaging in there?" He looked down at the injured creature. Station regulations were clear about alien life forms. Protocol demanded immediate quarantine and corporate notification. But those eyes watching him held such trust, such desperate hope. "Nothing but scrap metal, Captain Santos. Heading back now." David carefully wrapped the creature in his emergency blanket and tucked it inside his suit's cargo pouch. The little thing didn't struggle, just pressed against his chest like it was seeking warmth. As they left the wreckage behind, David wondered what he was getting himself into. Back on Titan's Rest, David smuggled his find to his quarters without being seen. The creature was barely conscious, its breathing getting weaker. David had basic medical training, but this was far beyond anything he knew how to handle. He needed help, and there was only one person on the station who might know what to do. Dr. Ruth Bailey looked skeptical when David appeared at her lab door. "You want me to what exactly?" "Just look at something." "Please, Ruth, it's important." When David opened the blanket, Ruth's expression changed completely. She leaned closer, her scientific curiosity overriding her caution. "My God, David, is this what I think it is?" The creature stirred at the sound of her voice, opening those intelligent eyes again. Ruth's breath caught. "It's a dragon. An actual dragon. That's impossible. Dragons are myths." "Not anymore." Ruth was already reaching for her medical scanner. "Help me get it to the examination table." "Carefully. It's in bad shape." For the next 3 hours, Ruth worked to stabilize the creature while David watched anxiously. She cleaned its burns, set its broken wing in a biocast, and hooked it up to a nutrient drip. The dragon, because that's clearly what it was, slept through most of it, occasionally making soft sounds that tugged at David's heart. "It's incredible," Ruth said, studying her scans. "The bone structure, the nervous system complexity. This isn't just an animal, David. The brain development suggests intelligence equal to or exceeding human levels. But it's just a baby." "Exactly. And someone threw it away to die in space." Ruth's voice held quiet anger. "The ship's wreckage suggests it was deliberately sabotaged. This little one was meant to perish with whoever was caring for it." David felt his own anger rising. Who could abandon something so young and helpless? The dragon stirred, and David instinctively reached out to stroke its head. The creature leaned into his touch, making that soft purring sound. "What are we going to do?" David asked. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "Regulations say we should report this immediately. Corporate will want it shipped to a research facility on Earth. It'll spend its life in a lab cage." The dragon's eyes opened again, looking directly at David. In that gaze, he saw trust, hope, and something that looked remarkably like affection. The creature had bonded with him, recognizing him as its rescuer. "I can't let that happen," David said quietly. "Neither can I." Ruth smiled. "But keeping it secret won't be easy. Dragons grow fast, and this one will need specialized care. We'll figure it out." David gently picked up the small creature, and it immediately curled against his chest. What should we call you, little guy? The dragon made a soft chirping sound and its scales flickered with what looked like tiny sparks of electricity. The lights in the lab dimmed momentarily. Did you see that? Ruth asked excitedly. It's interfacing with our electrical system somehow. The bioelectric field readings are off the charts. Ember, David said suddenly. Because of the sparks. We'll call you Ember. The dragon, Ember, looked up at him and made a sound that was unmistakably pleased. David felt his heart melt completely. He'd lost his wife Sarah 2 years ago in a transport accident, and grief had made him withdraw from everyone except his 12-year-old son Leo. But holding this small, trusting creature awakened something in him he thought was gone forever. Ember it is, Ruth said. But David, you realize what you're taking on? This isn't a pet. Dragons are legendary for a reason. When he grows up, he'll be incredibly powerful. David looked down at the tiny creature sleeping peacefully in his arms. Right now, Ember was just a scared, injured baby who needed love and protection. The future could take care of itself. Then we'll make sure he grows up knowing how to use that power responsibly, David said. We'll raise him right. Ruth nodded, understanding the commitment they were both making. I'll help however I can, but we'll need to be careful. If anyone finds out, they won't, David promised, gently stroking Ember's scales. The dragon's breathing was already stronger and his color was improving. Love and care were working better than any medicine. As David carried Ember toward his quarters, he thought about Leo. His son had been struggling since Sarah's death, withdrawing into himself just like David had. Maybe having someone to care for would help them both heal. What David didn't know was that this small act of compassion would eventually change the fate of 2 civilizations. For now, though, all that mattered was getting Ember home safely and figuring out how to explain to a 12-year-old boy why their family had just grown by one very special dragon. The maintenance tunnel hummed with activity as Ember squeezed through spaces no human could reach. His scales, now a deep emerald green with copper highlights, scraped gently against the narrow walls as he worked. At 5 years old, he stood nearly 4 feet tall, much smaller than he should be according to Dr. Bailey's research, but perfect for the cramped spaces aboard Titan's Rest. Eddie, can you reach the coupling joint near the power relay? David's voice crackled through the comm unit attached to Ember's collar. Ember, or Eddie as he preferred to be called now, extended one clawed hand toward the malfunctioning component. Blue electricity danced across his fingertips as he interfaced with the station's systems. The damaged circuit responded to his touch, rewiring itself at the molecular level. The tunnel lights flickered once, then glowed steadier than they had in months. All fixed, Dad, Eddie said, crawling backward through the tunnel. The word Dad still made David smile every time he heard it. When Eddie emerged into the main engineering bay, Leo was waiting with a protein bar and a cup of synthetic juice. At 17, Leo had grown tall and lean like his father, but he still treated Eddie like the little brother he'd become. Show off, Leo said affectionately, handing Eddie the snacks. Remember when you used to be afraid of the electrical panels? Eddie settled into his favorite spot, a pile of soft blankets near the main console where he could watch the station's operations. I was 3, and you were afraid of the gravity lifts until you were 10. That's different. Those things are death traps. Their easy banter was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Maria Santos, her expression more serious than usual. Behind her walked a woman Eddie didn't recognize, tall, sharp-eyed, wearing the uniform of Earth Central Command. David, we need to talk, Captain Santos said. All of you. Eddie felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Strangers usually meant trouble, especially ones who looked at him like he was something dangerous. He moved closer to David, who placed a protective hand on his shoulder. This is Commander Patricia Wells from Fleet Intelligence, Captain Santos continued. She has some news about Titan's Rest. Commander Wells stepped forward, her gaze lingering on Eddie with obvious interest. Mr. Cruz, I understand you've been harboring an undocumented alien life form for 5 years. The silence stretched painfully. Eddie's scales began to shimmer with nervous energy, and the lights around them dimmed slightly. Leo moved to stand beside him while Dr. Bailey emerged from her lab with a defiant expression. Eddie is part of our crew, David said carefully. He's been helping maintain this station since he was big enough to hold tools. I'm sure he has, Commander Wells replied. But that's about to change. Titan's Rest is being decommissioned. Corporate has decided the mining yields no longer justify the operational costs. Eddie felt like the floor had dropped away. Titan's Rest was home. It was the only place he'd ever known. the only place where he belonged. There's more, Commander Wells continued. 3 months ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected energy signatures matching the wreckage where you found Eddie. The signals originated from the void sector. Beyond the outer rim, Dr. Bailey stepped forward. What kind of signals? Ships, big ones. And they're heading this way. Commander Wells pulled out a datapad, showing sensor readings that meant nothing to Eddie but made David's face go pale. We've identified the species. They're called the Drakmori, a warrior race we thought was extinct. Extinct? Leo asked. According to our xenoarchaeological records, the Drakmori once controlled a vast empire spanning dozens of systems. They were incredibly advanced, incredibly powerful, and incredibly violent. Their civilization collapsed about 3,000 years ago in a series of civil wars that left their homeworlds uninhabitable. Eddie's throat felt dry. What does this have to do with me? Commander Wells looked at him directly for the first time. You're one of them. The last surviving member of a species that could destroy entire star systems. The words hit Eddie like a physical blow. The lights around them flickered wildly as his emotions spiked. Dr. Bailey quickly moved to his side, placing a calming hand on his arm. That's impossible, David said firmly. Eddie isn't violent. He's never hurt anyone. Maybe not yet, Commander Wells replied. But do you have any idea what he's capable of? Our analysis of the wreckage suggests Drakmori biotechnology could interface with any electronic system. They could shut down planetary defense grids with a thought, overload fusion reactors, crash entire fleets by disrupting their navigation systems. Eddie stared at his hands that had always seemed perfectly normal to him. The blue electricity that danced across his fingertips suddenly looked sinister. Had he been carrying this capacity for destruction all along without knowing it? Eddie's not like that, Leo said angrily. He's my brother. He saved this station a dozen times over. I'm not questioning his loyalty to you, Commander Wells said more gently. But his people are coming, and when they arrive, they'll want him back. How do you know they're coming here? Dr. Bailey asked. Because they've been following the energy trail from his crashed ship. The Drakmori don't leave their own behind, especially not their young. They've been searching for him for 5 years. Eddie felt panic rising in his chest. Everything he'd ever known, everyone he'd ever loved, was suddenly under threat because of what he was. The electrical systems around them began to fluctuate more violently as his distress grew. Eddie, breathe, David said calmly, kneeling beside him. Nothing's changed. You're still our family. But I'm dangerous, Eddie whispered. What if I hurt you? What if they hurt you because of me? Hey. Leo sat down on Eddie's other side. Remember when I had that fever when I was 14? You stayed up for 3 days straight monitoring my vital signs through the medical bay sensors. You saved my life. That's different. No, it's not. You use your abilities to help people because that's who you are. That's how we raised you. Commander Wells watched this exchange with something that might have been sympathy. I'm sorry to disrupt your family, but we need to prepare for what's coming. The Drakmori fleet will reach this system within the week. What do they want? David asked. We don't know. Our only information comes from ancient records and archaeological sites. But if they're anything like their ancestors, they'll view humans as inferior beings barely worth their notice. Eddie felt sick. His real family, his biological parents, thought humans were worthless. But humans were the only family he'd ever known or wanted. There's something else, Dr. Bailey said quietly. Eddie's development has been unusual. He's much smaller than Drakmori should be at his age, and his neural patterns show significant differences from what we'd expect. What kind of differences? Commander Wells asked. Hybrid thinking processes. His brain shows both Drakmori patterns and something completely new, structures that seem to have developed from his interaction with humans. He's not just a Drakmori raised by humans. He's become something else entirely. Eddie didn't understand all the technical terms, but he grasped the basic meaning. He wasn't fully human, but he wasn't fully Drakmori either. He was caught between two worlds, belonging completely to neither. The evacuation begins tomorrow, Commander Wells said. Essential personnel will transfer to other stations. The rest will return to Earth. And Eddie? David asked. Commander Wells was quiet for a moment. That depends on what his people want when they arrive. As the commander left, Eddie sat surrounded by his human family, feeling more alone than he had since that first night in the crashed ship. Somewhere in the void beyond the stars, his biological family was coming for him. But all he wanted was to stay here, in the warmth and safety of the only home he'd ever known. The thought of leaving David, Leo, and Dr. Bailey made his chest tight with pain. But the thought of his presence bringing danger to them was even worse. For the first time in his life, Eddie understood what fear really meant. Not the fear of being hurt, but the fear of hurting the people you love most. The shadow fell across Titan's Rest like the wing of some impossible bird. Eddie pressed his face against the observation deck window, staring up at the massive ship that had emerged from hyperspace just hours ago. The vessel was easily 20 times the size of their mining station, its hull black as space itself and covered in symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "It's beautiful," Leo whispered beside him. Eddie shivered. Beautiful, yes, but also terrifying. The ship radiated power that he could feel even through the station's hull, a deep, thrumming energy that resonated in his bones and made his scales tingle with recognition. "The boarding craft is approaching," Captain Santos announced over the comm system. "All non-essential personnel to emergency stations. David, bring Eddie to docking bay 3. Eddie's legs felt weak as they walked through the corridors. Other crew members watched him pass with expressions ranging from curiosity to fear. Word had spread quickly about what was happening. After 5 years of being just Eddie the engineer's kid, he was suddenly Eddie the alien. Eddie the unknown threat. The docking bay was nearly empty except for Captain Santos, Commander Wells, and a security team that looked like they weren't sure whether they were there to protect Eddie or protect everyone else from him. Dr. Bailey squeezed his shoulder reassuringly as they waited. The Drakmori shuttle was sleek and organic-looking, more grown than built. It settled onto the deck with barely a whisper of sound, and Eddie felt his heart hammering as the airlock cycled open. The first figure to emerge was clearly a warrior. Nearly 8 feet tall, covered in scales that shifted from deep red to gold with wings folded against a powerful frame. But it was the second figure that made Eddie's breath catch. The dragon that stepped onto the deck was massive, 12 feet tall with scales like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with ancient intelligence. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, making the air itself seem to vibrate. When those burning eyes fixed on Eddie, the station's lights flickered. "My son." The voice was deep and resonant, carrying harmonics that made Eddie's bones ache. The great dragon moved forward with fluid grace, each step precise and controlled. The humans unconsciously moved back, but Eddie found himself frozen in place. "You are smaller than I expected," the dragon continued, switching to English with only a slight accent. "But you carry the blood. I am Corvin, warlord of the Eastern clans. I am your father." Eddie stared up at this magnificent, terrifying creature and felt nothing but fear. This was supposed to be his parent, but they shared nothing except genetics. Where Eddie was small and gentle, Corvin was huge and intimidating. Where Eddie spoke softly, Corvin's voice commanded attention. They were nothing alike. "My name is Eddie," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Corvin's expression darkened. "You have been given a human designation. Your true name is Emberthak, heir of the Eastern clans, last son of the Imperial line." "I prefer Eddie." The silence that followed was deafening. The red-scaled warrior beside Corvin shifted uncomfortably, and Eddie could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. "You prefer?" Corvin's voice was dangerously quiet. "You are Drakmori nobility. You do not prefer. You command." David stepped forward protectively. "He's been through a lot. Maybe we could—" Corvin's gaze fixed on David, and the human stumbled backward as if physically struck. "You will not speak unless addressed, lesser being. My son has been contaminated by your primitive influence long enough." Eddie felt anger flare in his chest. "Don't talk to him like that. David is my father." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Corvin's scales darkened to pure black, and the temperature in the docking bay seemed to drop several degrees. "Your father is a human?" Corvin's voice carried disbelief and disgust. "You claim kinship with these creatures." "They're not creatures," Eddie said, his own scales beginning to shimmer with agitation. "They're my family. They saved me, raised me, loved me. They weakened you." Corvin gestured dismissively. "Look at yourself. You should stand 7 feet tall by now. Your wings should span 15 feet. Instead, you cower like a hatchling because these humans have taught you to be small." Dr. Bailey found her voice. "Eddie's development has been affected by trauma, not by our care. We've given him everything we could." Corvin laughed, a sound like grinding stone. You gave him sentiment and weakness. I will give him power and purpose. He turned back to Eddie. Come. It is time to reclaim your heritage. I don't want to go with you. The words came out before Eddie could stop them. Corvin's eyes widened in what might have been shock, then narrowed dangerously. You refuse your own blood? I refuse to abandon my family. Corvin studied Eddie for a long moment, then made a gesture to the red-scaled warrior. Bring the memories. The warrior activated a device that projected a holographic display above their heads. Images flickered to life, vast cities of crystal and metal, dragons soaring between towers that reached into the clouds, fleets of ships stretching across star systems. This was our empire, Corvin said, his voice filled with pride and loss. We ruled 1,000 worlds, commanded technologies beyond human comprehension. We were gods among the stars. The images shifted to show war, dragons fighting dragons, cities burning, fleets destroying each other in the vacuum of space. Eddie watched in horror as the magnificent civilization tore itself apart. Civil war destroyed us, Corvin continued. Brother fought brother, clan against clan, until our worlds were ash and our people scattered. But you, my son, can restore what was lost. How? You carry the pure bloodline. You can activate the ancient weapons, unite the scattered clans. With you at my side, we can rebuild the empire. Eddie felt sick. By conquering other species? By treating everyone else like servants? By taking our rightful place as rulers of the galaxy? Corvin's voice grew passionate. You have lived among humans too long. You have forgotten what it means to be Drakmori. I was never Drakmori, Eddie said quietly. I was raised human. I think like a human. I care about things humans care about. Corvin's expression grew cold. Then you will learn to think differently. He made another gesture, and the hologram changed to show a blue-green world orbiting a yellow star. Earth. Eddie's blood turned to ice as he recognized his adopted species' homeworld. This is where these creatures come from, Corvin said casually. A primitive world with primitive inhabitants. It would be unfortunate if something were to happen to it. The threat was clear. Captain Santos stepped forward angrily, but Commander Wells held her back with a warning look. You're threatening to destroy Earth? Eddie asked, hardly believing what he was hearing. I'm explaining consequences, Corvin replied smoothly. You have responsibilities to your people, your bloodline, your destiny. Personal attachments cannot be allowed to interfere with duty. Eddie looked around at the faces of his human family, David's protective anger, Leo's frightened confusion, Dr. Bailey's quiet courage. These people had given him everything good in his life. They had taught him to be kind, to help others, to use his abilities responsibly. Now his biological father was threatening to murder billions of innocent people if Eddie didn't abandon everything he believed in. I need time to think, Eddie said finally. Corvin nodded as if he had expected this. You have one day. Then you will choose. Your duty to the Drakmori, or the lives of every human in this system. As the boarding party prepared to leave, Corvin paused beside Eddie. Do not mistake my patience for weakness, my son. I have searched for you across the galaxy for 5 years. I will not leave without you. After the Drakmori had gone, Eddie collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. His real father was a warlord who saw humans as expendable insects. His people expected him to help rebuild an empire built on conquest and oppression. What am I going to do? He asked quietly. David knelt beside him, taking Eddie's scaled hands in his own. Whatever you decide, we'll face it together. That's what families do. But Eddie knew it wasn't that simple. Corvin had made it clear that his human family would never be safe as long as Eddie remained with them. The dragon he had become through their love and care was exactly what made him valuable to the Drakmori, and exactly what put everyone he cared about in danger. For the first time in his life, Eddie understood that sometimes love meant making the hardest choice of all. The transport beam felt like being dissolved and rebuilt at the molecular level. When Eddie's vision cleared, he stood in a vast chamber aboard the Drakmori dreadnought, surrounded by technology that hummed with organic life. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, and patterns of light flowed across surfaces like veins carrying luminous blood. Welcome to the heart of storms, Corvin said, his massive form moving with predatory grace across the chamber. Flagship of the Eastern Fleet, forge of our people's future. Eddie tried not to show how overwhelmed he felt. Everything was built on a scale that dwarfed human construction. Corridors wide enough for dragons in full flight, ceilings that vanished into shadows high above. The very air tasted of ozone and ancient power. "Come," Corvin commanded. "There is much you must learn." They walked through passages lined with crystalline displays showing star charts, fleet positions, and what looked like tactical assessments. Other Drakmori moved through the corridors. Warriors like the red-scaled one from the docking bay, smaller dragons that might have been technicians or scholars, and a few that were clearly very young. The hatchlings made Eddie's heart ache. They reminded him of what he must have looked like when David first found him, but these younglings moved with confidence and purpose he had never possessed. They belonged here in ways he never could. "Your quarters," Corvin said, gesturing toward an arched entrance. The chamber beyond was spacious and beautifully appointed, with perches for a dragon's natural sleeping position, and walls that displayed slowly shifting patterns of deep blue and green. "Rest, we have much to discuss tomorrow." Eddie barely slept. The ship's constant motion through hyperspace felt wrong compared to the steady rotation of Titan's rest, and the alien sounds kept him alert and nervous. When Corvin summoned him the next morning, Eddie felt exhausted and disoriented. "Today you begin to understand your heritage," Corvin announced, leading Eddie to a chamber dominated by a massive holographic display. "Tell me, what do you know of Drakmori history?" "Nothing," Eddie admitted. "I didn't even know we existed until a few days ago." Corvin's expression was unreadable. "Then you know nothing of the Great Expansion, when our ancestors first took to the stars. Nothing of the Golden Age when Drakmori science unlocked the secrets of space and time. Nothing of the Empire's glory when 100 species served our wisdom and strength." The hologram came alive, showing scenes of impossible beauty, dragons soaring between crystal spires, fast ships that seemed to be grown rather than built, technologies that turned planets into gardens and stars into sources of infinite energy. "We were not conquerors," Corvin continued, his voice filled with pride. "We were guardians, bringing order to chaos, civilization to barbarism. Under Drakmori rule, wars ended, diseases were cured, poverty became extinct." "What happened?" Eddie asked, captivated despite himself. Corvin's expression darkened. "Corruption. Weakness. Some of our people began to believe that other species deserved equality, that the Empire should be a partnership rather than a proper hierarchy. They forgot that with great power comes the responsibility to rule." The images shifted to show civil war, dragons fighting dragons while their subject species watched in confusion and terror. Eddie saw worlds burning, fleets destroying each other, the magnificent empire tearing itself apart. "The war lasted 3 centuries, Corvin said quietly. "When it ended, our homeworlds were ash. Our people scattered across the galaxy as refugees. The other species we had protected turned against us, hunting us like criminals. We went from rulers to outcasts in a single generation." Eddie felt a stab of sympathy for his people's suffering, but something in the story bothered him. "What about the species you ruled? Were they happy?" Corvin looked at him sharply. "They were protected, fed, given purpose. But were they free?" "Freedom is a luxury for those strong enough to seize it," Corvin replied dismissively. "The weak need guidance, structure, protection from their own destructive impulses." They moved to another chamber where Eddie met other members of the crew. Most treated him with a mixture of reverence and disappointment. Clearly, he was not what they had expected in their prophesied heir. A few younger dragons showed genuine friendliness, but even they seemed puzzled by his small size and hesitant manner. The worst moment came during the afternoon meal. The ship's dining hall was filled with dragons of all ages, their scales displaying the complex color patterns that indicated clan allegiance and social rank. Eddie felt awkward and out of place as Corvin introduced him. "The last heir of the Imperial line," Corvin announced, his voice carrying throughout the hall. "Raised among humans but pure of blood." The reaction was mixed. Some dragons stood and roared approval, their voices shaking the chamber. Others remained seated, their expressions skeptical. A few openly showed disgust, their scales darkening with what Eddie was beginning to recognize as contempt. "He smells of human weakness," one of the older warriors muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Eddie's scales flushed with embarrassment and anger. The lights around them flickered as his emotions spiked, and suddenly every dragon in the hall was staring at him with new interest. "Ah," Corvin said with satisfaction. "There it is. Show them, my son. Show them your power." But Eddie didn't know how. The electrical discharge had been instinctive, driven by emotion rather than conscious control. He stood there feeling exposed and helpless while dozens of ancient, powerful beings watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to scorn. "Perhaps the heir needs more training," someone called out, and several dragons laughed. The humiliation was overwhelming. Eddie fled the dining hall, ignoring Corvin's calls behind him. He found himself in an observation deck looking out at the stars, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. "They're not wrong, you know." Eddie turned to find a young dragon approaching, probably only a few years older than himself, with scales of deep purple shot through with silver. Unlike the others, this one moved with easy grace rather than formal dignity. "I'm sorry," Eddie said. "You do smell different," the dragon continued with a slight smile. "Not weak exactly, but softer. I'm Nyx, by the way, third daughter of the northern clans. Eddie, though apparently my name is actually Emberthak." "Names are important to the elders," Nyx said, settling beside him at the observation window. "They think using your birth name will somehow make you more Drakmori. But identity isn't about what you're called, it's about what you choose to become." Eddie looked at her gratefully. "You don't think I'm a disappointment?" "I think you're different. Whether that's disappointing depends on what you do with that difference." Nyx gestured toward the stars outside. "Do you know why your father is really so determined to find you?" "Because I'm the heir?" "Because you're the key to the Nexus weapons." Eddie had never heard the term before, and his confusion must have shown on his face. "Ancient Drakmori technology," Nyx explained. "Weapons capable of destroying entire star systems, but they can only be activated by someone of pure Imperial bloodline. Your father believes that with those weapons, he can force the scattered clans to unite under his leadership." A chill ran down Eddie's spine. He wants to restart the war? He wants to finish it. Reclaim the Empire, put the other species back in their proper place. Nyx's voice was carefully neutral. "The question is, do you?" Before Eddie could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. Emergency lights bathed everything in red, and Corvin's voice echoed from the communication system. "All crew to battle stations. We have encountered a refugee convoy attempting to flee our territory." Through the observation window, Eddie could see them, 3 small ships, clearly civilian, limping through space with obvious damage to their hulls. They looked helpless and desperate. "Refugee convoy?" Eddie asked. Nyx's expression was grim. "Drakmori who refused to join your father's crusade. He's been hunting them across the sector, trying to force them to accept his leadership." Eddie watched in growing horror as the Dreadnought's weapon systems came online. Energy began building in the massive cannons that could vaporize the refugee ships in seconds. "He's going to destroy them? Unless they surrender completely. Your father doesn't tolerate dissent." Eddie felt something break inside him. These were his people. Drakmori families just trying to live their lives without being forced into another war. And his biological father was prepared to murder them for refusing to bow to his authority. Without thinking, Eddie pressed his hands against the nearest control panel. Power flowed through him, more than he had ever channeled before. Throughout the ship, systems flickered and sparked as he reached out with abilities he barely understood. The weapon systems went offline. In the sudden silence, Eddie could hear his own heart pounding. He had just committed an act of sabotage against the most powerful Drakmori warlord in the galaxy. "Well," Nyx said quietly, "I guess that answers my question about what kind of dragon you choose to be." Before Eddie could respond, the chamber doors burst open and Corvin strode in, his scales black with rage. But when he saw Eddie standing at the control panel with energy still crackling around his hands, his expression changed to something that might have been pride. "Magnificent," Corvin breathed.
"Such power, and you've barely begun to access your potential."
Eddie stared at his father in confusion. "But I stopped you from attacking the refugees. And in doing so, you demonstrated abilities I had only dreamed you might possess." Corvin moved closer, his eyes burning with ambition. "Do you understand what you just did? You interfaced with the ship's entire defensive grid simultaneously. No Drakmori has shown such power in over 1,000 years. The revelation hit Eddie like a physical blow. His father wasn't angry about the sabotage. He was delighted by the proof of Eddie's capabilities. The lives of those refugees meant nothing to him compared to confirming his son's potential as a weapon. You saved them, Eddie said weakly. I saved them because you asked me to, and because you have shown me that my patience will be rewarded. Corvin's smile was terrible. Soon, my son, you will understand that mercy is a luxury we cannot afford. When the time comes to reclaim our empire, you will use that power as it was meant to be used. As Corvin left, Eddie sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the implications of what had just happened. He had more power than he'd ever imagined, but every demonstration of that power only made him more valuable to people who wanted to use it for purposes that sickened him. Nick sat beside him quietly. Now you know why some of us choose to be refugees, she said softly. Power without conscience is just another form of tyranny. Eddie stared out at the stars, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on him like a physical force. Somewhere out there, his human family was waiting and worrying, and somewhere else, scattered Drakmori clans were fighting or fleeing or surrendering to warlords who saw them as tools for rebuilding an empire built on oppression. He was caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, but somehow responsible for the fate of both. Eddie's escape pod tumbled through space toward Titan's Rest, its hull scarred from the hasty launch he'd made from the Drakmori dreadnought. Behind him, Corvin's entire fleet hung in the void like predators waiting to strike. Eddie had managed to disable several key systems during his escape, but he knew it would only buy him minutes. The mining station looked painfully small and fragile compared to the massive warships surrounding it. Eddie could see human evacuation shuttles still departing, tiny specks of light fleeing toward the system's edge. Most of the crew had already been moved to safety, but David, Leo, Dr. Bailey, and a skeleton crew remained behind. Eddie. Leo's voice crackled over the comm as Eddie's pod docked with shaking hands. Thank God you're okay. We saw the explosions on the Drakmori ship. I'm sorry, Eddie said as he stumbled out of the pod. I tried to stop him, but I only made things worse. David was waiting in the docking bay, along with Captain Santos and Commander Wells. Their faces showed relief at seeing him safe, but also the grim knowledge of what was coming. Report, Commander Wells said briskly. Corvin isn't just a warlord, Eddie said, struggling to catch his breath. He's planning to use me to activate weapons that can destroy entire star systems. He wants to rebuild the Drakmori Empire and put every other species under their control. What kind of weapons? Dr. Bailey asked, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. Something called the Nexus Array. Ancient technology that only responds to Imperial bloodline. Eddie's scales flickered with agitation. He showed me what our people used to be like, Ruth. They ruled 100 worlds, treated other species like servants. He thinks that was the natural order. Captain Santos shook her head. One species controlling everyone else? That's not civilization, that's tyranny. That's what I told him. Eddie slumped against the docking bay wall. I can't go back there, but I can't stay here either. As long as I'm with you, you're all in danger. Incoming transmission, the station's AI announced. Drakmori vessel requesting communication. They moved to the main control room, where Corvin's image appeared on the central screen. The warlord looked calm and composed, but Eddie could see the anger burning in his ancient eyes. My son has returned to his pets, Corvin said, his voice carrying clearly across the communication link. How touching. He's not your son, David said firmly, stepping protectively in front of Eddie. Family isn't about blood, it's about love, care, and sacrifice. Corvin laughed, a sound like grinding stone, spoken like a true inferior. You have raised my heir to be weak and sentimental, but that damage can be repaired. I don't want to be repaired, Eddie said, moving to stand beside David. I like who I am. I like caring about other people. You will learn otherwise. Corvin's image leaned forward. I offer you one final choice, Emberthak. Return to your people willingly, or watch as I demonstrate why the Drakmori once ruled the galaxy. The screen shifted to show tactical displays of the human evacuation fleet. Dozens of small ships fleeing toward the hyperspace jump point, filled with families and children and elderly civilians who had never hurt anyone. Those vessels carry nearly 10,000 humans, Corvin continued conversationally. Observe what happens to those who defy the natural order. The largest Drakmori warship began to glow with building energy. Eddie felt the power through the station's sensors. Enough destructive force to vaporize the entire evacuation fleet in seconds. No, Eddie shouted, pressing his hands against the nearest control panel. Power flowed through him as he reached out desperately toward the Drakmori ships. trying to disrupt their weapon systems like he had before. But Corvin was ready for him this time. Eddie felt his power slam against defensive barriers, sophisticated countermeasures that turned his abilities back on themselves. The station's lights exploded in showers of sparks as the redirected energy overloaded everything around him. "Did you think I would not learn from your previous display?" Corvin asked mockingly. "You have potential, my son, but you lack training and discipline." Through the observation windows, they could see the weapon charging reaching critical levels. In minutes, thousands of innocent people would die simply because they happened to be human. "Wait," Eddie said desperately. "I'll come with you. Just let them go." "No," David said firmly. "Eddie, you can't sacrifice yourself for us. I can't let you all die because of me." Eddie turned to face his human family, memorizing their faces. "This is my fault. If I hadn't been here, none of this would have happened." Leo grabbed his arm. "That's not true. You saved this station dozens of times. You're part of our crew, part of our family. And families protect each other," Dr. Bailey added. "We knew this day might come when we decided to keep you. We chose love over safety." Commander Wells was studying her tactical display with a grim expression. "The evacuation fleet won't reach the jump point in time. Even if Eddie surrenders, Corvin could still destroy them out of spite." Eddie felt despair washing over him. His human family would never be safe as long as Corvin saw them as leverage. The Drakmori warlord would always be able to threaten innocent people to force Eddie's compliance. "There has to be another way," Eddie whispered. Dr. Bailey suddenly straightened, her eyes wide with realization. "Eddie, remember what I told Commander Wells about your neural development? How living with humans changed your brain structure? What about it? You're not just a Drakmori with human values, you're something entirely new. A hybrid consciousness that combines the best of both species." Ruth's voice grew excited. "Your biological father sees power as domination, but you've learned to see it as responsibility." "I don't understand." "The Nexus weapons respond to Imperial bloodline, right? But what if bloodline isn't just about genetics? What if it's about the kind of leader you choose to become?" Eddie stared at her. "You think I could turn the weapons against Corvin? I think you could do something he never would. Choose not to use them at all." On the screen, Corvin was growing impatient. "You have 30 seconds to decide, Emberthak. Return to your duties or watch your pets burn." Eddie closed his eyes, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on him. Every choice led to suffering. Go with Corvin and become a weapon of conquest, or stay and watch innocent people die. Unless there was a third option. "I'll come," Eddie said finally. "But I want to say goodbye first." Corvin nodded magnanimously. "You have 5 minutes." The communication link closed and Eddie turned to his family. David's face was gray with grief while Leo looked angry and helpless. Captain Santos and Commander Wells were already calculating evacuation routes that wouldn't work. "I have a plan," Eddie said quietly. "But I need you to trust me." "What kind of plan?" David asked. "The kind that might get me killed." Eddie managed a shaky smile. "But if it works, it could end this without anyone else getting hurt." He explained quickly, a desperate gamble based on Dr. Bailey's theory about his hybrid nature and his growing understanding of Drakmori technology. It was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was the only way he could see to protect both species from Corvin's ambitions. "Absolutely not," David said when Eddie finished. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself." "It's not sacrifice," Eddie replied. "It's choice. For the first time in my life, I get to choose what kind of dragon I want to be." Leo hugged him fiercely. "Come back to us, okay? Whatever happens out there, remember that you're not alone." "I will," Eddie promised, though he wasn't sure it was a promise he could keep. As Eddie prepared to return to Corvin's ship, he took one last look around Titan's Rest, the corridors where he'd learned to walk, the engineering bay where he'd discovered his abilities, the observation deck where he'd dreamed of the stars. This small mining station had been his entire universe, and the people here had made him who he was. Now it was time to find out if who he was would be enough to save both the family he'd chosen and the people he'd been born to be. The transport beam activated, carrying Eddie back toward the massive Drakmori dreadnought. But this time, he wasn't going as a confused young dragon seeking his place in the universe. He was going as someone who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. The question was whether that would be enough to change the fate of two civilizations. The Nexus chamber deep within Corvin's dreadnought pulsed with ancient power. Crystalline formations jutted from the walls like frozen lightning, each one humming with energy that made Eddie's scales tingle. At the center of the chamber stood a platform surrounded by floating geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. Technology so advanced it seemed more like magic. "Behold the heart of our empire," Corvin said, his voice filled with reverence. "The Nexus control array, last functional unit of its kind. With this, the Imperial fleet once commanded weapons that could shatter moons and bend space itself." Eddie approached the platform cautiously. The energy field around it recognized something in his genetic code, parting to allow him access while keeping everyone else at bay. He could feel the vast network of dormant weapons scattered across the galaxy, waiting for the proper authorization to awaken. "Think of it," Corvin continued, his eyes burning with ambition. "The scattered clans will have no choice but to unite when they see our power restored. The humans will surrender their worlds peacefully rather than face annihilation. Order will return to the galaxy." "Order built on fear," Eddie said quietly, studying the alien controls. "Order built on strength. The strong lead, the weak follow. This is the natural way." Eddie placed his hands on the activation nodes, feeling the system respond to his touch. Information flowed into his mind. The locations of every Nexus weapon, their capabilities, the devastation they could unleash. Enough firepower to reduce entire star systems to cosmic dust. He also felt something else. The weapons weren't just tools of destruction. They were connected to a vast communications network that linked every Drakmori settlement across the galaxy. He could speak to all of them simultaneously, could show them what he had learned during his time with humans. "Activate the array," Corvin commanded. "Show the galaxy that the Drakmori have returned." Eddie's hands hovered over the final control sequence. One touch would give Corvin exactly what he wanted: the power to force unity through terror, to rebuild an empire on the foundation of conquest and submission. Instead, Eddie did something his father would never have expected. He opened a communication channel to every Drakmori settlement in the galaxy and began to speak. "My name is Eddie Cruz," he said, his voice carrying across light years to reach scattered clans and hidden colonies. "I was born Emberthak of the Imperial line, but I was raised by humans on a mining station called Titan's Rest. Through the network, he could feel thousands of Drakmori minds turning their attention to him, some with hope, some with skepticism, many with confusion. I've seen what we used to be," Eddie continued, "a great empire that brought order to the galaxy through conquest and control. I've also seen what we became, scattered refugees, hunted outcasts, people so desperate for the glory of the past that were willing to repeat the mistakes that destroyed us." Corvin's face was turning black with rage. "Silence! You will not undermine—" Eddie's power flared, temporarily disrupting the warlord's vocal cords. The energy field around the platform brightened, keeping Corvin at bay while Eddie continued his transmission. "But I've learned something else," Eddie said, thinking of David's gentle strength, Leo's loyal friendship, Dr. Bailey's patient wisdom. "I've learned that true power isn't about making others fear you. It's about making them trust you. It's not about commanding obedience. It's about inspiring others to be better than they thought they could be." The communication network hummed as responses began flooding in from across the galaxy. Some Drakmori denounced him as a traitor corrupted by human weakness, but others, especially the younger ones and the refugees, listened with growing hope. "The humans who raised me could have turned me over to their authorities," Eddie continued. "They could have used my abilities for their own gain. Instead, they taught me to help others, to fix things rather than break them, to care about people different from myself." Through the network, he shared his memories. David finding him as an injured hatchling, Leo teaching him to play chess, Dr. Bailey patiently explaining how technology worked, Captain Santos treating him as just another crew member despite his alien nature. "This is what we could become," Eddie said, his voice growing stronger. "Not conquerors, but partners. Not rulers, but friends. Not an empire built on the ruins of other civilizations, but a community where everyone has value." Corvin finally broke through the energy field, his massive form radiating fury. "Enough, you betray everything we are." "I'm showing them everything we could be," Eddie replied calmly. The warlord lunged forward, claws extended. Eddie could have used the Nexus weapons to destroy him instantly, could have turned the ship's own systems against its crew. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone present. He stepped away from the controls and faced Corvin with empty hands. "I won't fight you," Eddie said simply. "Violence is what destroyed our people the first time. I won't let it destroy us again." Corvin's claws stopped inches from Eddie's throat. "You would let me kill you?" "If that's what it takes to prove my point, yes." For a long moment, father and son stared at each other. Then incredibly, Corvin's rage began to fade. The ancient warlord looked at his small, defiant heir and saw something he hadn't expected. Not weakness, but a strength he didn't understand. "You truly believe this path can work?" Corvin asked quietly. "I believe it's worth trying," Eddie replied. "The old way gave us 3 centuries of civil war and the destruction of our civilization. Maybe it's time for a new way." Throughout the galaxy, the Drakmori communication network buzzed with debate. Clan leaders argued with each other while younger dragons asked questions that hadn't been considered in millennia. For the first time in generations, the scattered remnants of their people were talking to each other instead of fighting. The standoff was broken by an alert from the ship's sensors. A small human shuttle was approaching the dreadnought, broadcasting a message on all frequencies. "This is Leo Cruz, requesting permission to come aboard," came the familiar voice that made Eddie's heart leap. "I'm here to bring my brother home." Eddie felt tears stinging his eyes. Despite everything, the danger, the overwhelming odds, the fact that he might be walking into a trap, Leo had come for him. "Impossible," Corvin muttered. "No human would dare." "You don't understand humans very well," Eddie said with a slight smile. "When they love someone, they don't abandon them, no matter what." The communication link crackled as more voices joined in. David, Dr. Bailey, Captain Santos, even some of the evacuated crew members, all of them declaring their intention to stand by Eddie, regardless of the consequences. Corvin stared at the display in bewilderment. "They're willing to risk death for you? Just like I was willing to risk death for them," Eddie replied. "That's what family means." Something shifted in Corvin's expression, not understanding exactly, but perhaps the beginning of recognition that there were kinds of strength he had never learned to appreciate. Through the Nexus network, reports began coming in from across the galaxy. Younger Drakmori were leaving the military clans to join refugee settlements. Scientists were sharing research instead of hoarding it for their factions. Some groups were even reaching out to other species, offering aid instead of demanding submission. It wasn't a revolution. It was an evolution. The scattered children of a broken empire were slowly, carefully, beginning to remember that they were all part of the same people. Eddie deactivated the Nexus array, permanently locking out its weapon functions while leaving the communication network active. The galaxy's most dangerous weapons would never threaten anyone again, but the bonds between scattered Drakmori communities would remain strong. "What happens now?" Corvin asked, looking older and more tired than Eddie had ever seen him. "Now we rebuild," Eddie said. "Not an empire, but a civilization. Not through conquest, but through cooperation. And if other species reject us, if they remember our past and fear our return," Eddie smiled, thinking of his human family waiting in that small shuttle. "Then we show them we've changed. Not with words, but with actions, one day at a time, one act of kindness at a time." 6 months later, Eddie stood on the observation deck of New Haven, a space station built jointly by humans and Drakmori at the edge of known space. Through the vast windows, he could see ships from a dozen different species coming and going. Traders, diplomats, refugees seeking new homes, and scientists sharing knowledge. Leo stood beside him, now serving as one of the station's first human Drakmori cultural liaisons. David worked in the engineering section, teaching Drakmori technicians how to maintain systems without using bioelectric interfaces. Dr. Bailey ran the xenobiology lab, studying ways to help different species understand each other better. The work was hard and often frustrating. Centuries of mistrust didn't disappear overnight, and there were still Drakmori clans that preferred the old ways of conquest and dominance. But progress was being made one small step at a time. "Do you ever miss it?" Leo asked, watching a group of young Drakmori playing with alien children in the station's central garden. "The simple life back on Titan's Rest?" Eddie considered the question seriously. He did miss the intimacy of their small mining station, the feeling that everyone was family, and every problem could be solved with enough patience and ingenuity. But he looked out at the vast star field beyond the station, and felt something he had never expected to feel, wonder instead of fear. Each point of light represented a world where different species were learning to work together, where children grew up thinking that cooperation was normal, and war was a terrible mistake from the past, where the future held possibilities that none of them could imagine alone. "No," Eddie said finally. "I think this is where we're supposed to be." A soft chime indicated an incoming message from one of the outer settlements. A new group of refugees had arrived, a mix of species fleeing some conflict in the Rim territories. They needed food, medical attention, and help finding permanent homes. Eddie smiled and headed toward the docking bay. There was work to do, people to help, and a future to build. The stars still held dangers and uncertainties that sometimes made him anxious, but they also held hope. And hope, he had learned from his human family, was always worth the risk.